Hello and thank you for listening to what is a special podcast episode of Past Conversations with me, Paul Hamilton. Now, I'm recording this today on the 13th of March 2021, and there's a very good reason as to why I'm doing it today, and that's because it's 80 years since the events of the Clydebank Blitz on the 13th and 14th of March 1941, and it's that I would like to talk to you about today. So over the course of 2 nights, the densely populated town of Clydebank, which at that point had a population of around 55,000, suffered a devastating aerial bombardment at the hands of the Luftwaffe. Official records put the death toll from the time at 528, but it's really almost certain that in fact many more civilians did lose their lives. Home to heavy industry, most notably the shipyards along the River Clyde, Clydebank was an obvious target. Explaining then why 439 German bombers dropped in excess of 1,650 incendiary containers and 272 tons of bombs down onto the town. For those below the experience, it must have been akin to a disaster movie, huddled together at the base of tenement closes, the town crumbling around its residents, claiming hundreds of lives as it did. The German pilots in the sky, well, they faced little difficulty locating the town. They had a clear, moonlit sky. It was a bomber's night. The destruction, therefore, was on an unimaginable scale. Around 2/3 of all the houses in Clydebank were either destroyed or were damaged. By the end of the 2-night bombardment, only 7 homes were reported as having escaped any form of damage whatsoever. That aside, however, the German perspective of this is that the air raids were not successful. The focus of the attack had been the key industrial targets of the town. John Brown's shipyard, Singer sewing machine factory, businesses which at that time had a real substantial war-related output. But they in fact suffered very little damage. The only business of the town which has suffered damage to the extent that production was in any way impacted is reported as being the Strathclyde Hosiery Company. The residents, however, their story's different. The official death toll, as I've mentioned, is recorded at 528, with 617 reported as being seriously injured. These figures, however, they are dubious. A more realistic death toll would now be in the region of 1,200. Following the Blitz, we have around 35,000 people made homeless, many of them having to walk for miles with whatever possessions they could gather together and carry on their person in search of refuge from those in nearby communities. Angus Calder, historian, described Clydebank as having the honour of suffering the most nearly universal damage of any British town. So how did it all begin? Well, at 9 p.m. on the 13th of March 1941, the air raid sirens begin to sound all along the River Clyde. Within minutes, the bombers are in the sky, they're above Clydebank, and the threat is obvious. Heinkel crews of the KGR 100 bomber group, they look down upon the town and they set about the business of establishing their targets. The moonlight reflected upon the river, the canal and the road surfaces below, creating a silver glaze which illuminated the town, distinguishing it from sections of nearby countryside. The first bombers, they laid the path for those to follow, small, high explosives lighting the town from afar, making the task of identifying the town from above just too easy. Flying from their bases in northern Europe, the Luftwaffe was able to hone in the town, drop explosive charges to terrifying effect. This included incendiary devices composed of magnesium alloy with thermite that has a capacity to melt steel, particularly useful when you're going after industrial targets. Reports from the time mentioned that in the early stages of the aerial bombardment, local distilleries were even alight. So severe was the damage, in fact, that there are accounts of waterways alight with burning whisky flowing in the direction of the River Clyde. Buildings were quickly flattened and fire had taken hold of many streets. Residents attempted to flee from collapsing tenements, but in many instances there was just not enough time. In the centre of the town, an area of houses referred to as the Holy City, due to the fact that the flat-roofed style housing, which was common in Jerusalem, that area was now under a rain of heavy bombs and parachute mines. It was ablaze and taking an almighty toll. Struggling to respond, the emergency response was hampered, severely hampered. Difficulties of communication resulting in confusion, made worse by the fact that we had destroyed roads, collapsed buildings. Rescue workers could not get to where they were most crucially needed. But what about fighting back? Well, there was an attempt, a valiant attempt, to fight back. Night fighters, barrage balloons, anti-aircraft ACAT guns, all used. But unfortunately, they had little impact. What is notable from the fight back was the involvement of the Polish Navy destroyer, the ORP Piran, a vessel which at that time happened to be docked in John Brown's shipyard to undergo repairs. That meant our crew were free to explore the bars of nearby Glasgow on the evening of 13th of March 1941 when the bombs began to fall. And there are accounts of these sailors running for miles out of the bars, down by the river, heading back to the ship to try and take up position and fire back on the Luftwaffe in the sky above. Such is the recognition for what the Poles did to try and defend the town of Clydebank that in 1994 a memorial area was created adjacent to Clydebank Town Hall, referred to as Solidarity Plaza, a tribute to the people of Poland from the people of Clydebank. So what is the reality of all of this? Well, across Clydebank there was almost nowhere that the impact of the two-day blitz had never been felt. In one street alone, there were 80 recorded deaths due to an explosion from a parachute mine. Either crushed to death in collapsing buildings, burned in the fires caused by explosions, the fate of many people from the town, it is just difficult to comprehend. Vital supplies were quickly exhausted and responders did all they humanly could. Makeshift aid stations, rescue centres were at capacity, struggling to cope with the large numbers of the wounded and the dying. Upon the all clear, after 2 days of intense bombardment, the town was unrecognisable to those who had survived. The scale of the destruction in relative terms was beyond comparison. Huge numbers of survivors were forced to leave the town, never to return. Approximately 4,000 houses were completely destroyed, along with schools, churches and many other key buildings. Clydebank was all but flattened. As for the industrial locations which had made Clydebank a target in the first place, there was some damage, but nothing like the damage which had been inflicted upon the surrounding town. The timber yard at Singer had caught fire, and the Admiralty oil depot was reported to have lost a significant amount of fuel, but both sites remained operational after the bombardment was over. How was what happened reported? Well, in the aftermath of the Clydebank Blitz, there was obvious hardship for the townspeople, but there was a sense of resolve among the population, a clear indication that there was a desire to rebuild and resist. That's not to say there was no despair or anguish, far from it in fact. Whole families had been lost, streets torn apart, a community been shattered. The scars of the Blitz can still be seen in the town today on the few surviving original buildings with cracks from bombs and shrapnel damage, and of course in the minds of those who lived through the experience. To survive such an ordeal was a trauma in itself. John Bowman, who was on active service at the time of the Clydebank Blitz, he recounts during a BBC interview how he returned home to discover his house had been destroyed, his mother, 2 brothers and a younger sister had all been killed. Yet outside Scotland, the Clydebank Blitz is rarely discussed or even heard of. In comparison to other large-scale bombardments in the likes of Coventry and London, its place is somewhat overlooked and overshadowed. Censorship had a role to play in this. There are accounts from the time of a bombing in Western Scotland, but almost no mention of Clydebank. There were no official visits by government members, no film crews in the aftermath of what happened. There was, in a sense, a media blackout. Confusion also exists between Clydebank and Glasgow in official reports. Both town and city, they neighbour each other, but they have their own distinct identities. It is owing to this confusion that there exists so much uncertainty about the death toll. Many figures from the time wrongly cite Glasgow, when in fact they ought to have been referring to Clydebank. So why was what happened in Clydebank so heavily censored and wrongly reported? The most obvious reason was the significance of the town in military terms. As a leading producer of ships, munitions and ordnance, there was a deliberate attempt to cover up what had happened. Because if reports of the failure to significantly damage industrial targets had reached Germany, there was a fear that further bombardments would be likely. In the novel The Holy City by Meg Henderson, there is an account of the lack of attention towards Clydebank and the resentment it created. What Clydebank has never understood, Meg says, is why in Coventry and London the newsreel films were widely broadcast with proud boasts of "we can take it," while in Clydebank the official view was that there had been little damage and few casualties. So what is a legacy? Robert Cochran, for example, is a survivor of the Clydebank Blitz. On the evening of the 13th of March 1941, he was in his tenement house in the Dalmuir area of the town. Aged 4 years old, he was with his family when the bombs began to drop. Yet despite the passing of more than 70 years, he remembers the events with tremendous clarity. His reply when asked how he is able to remember it so vividly is, "How could I ever forget?" He recalls how he lived with his mother and his younger brother. His younger brother was Wallace, only 17 months old. Robert's father was not home at this time, as he'd been deployed to serve with the Russian convoys as a sailor in the Royal Navy. So in the house on the night of the 13th of March 1941, Robert is joined by other members of his family, including his grandmother and his aunt. The three-storey tenement they were all in was hit by a falling bomb. Robert describes how everything collapsed around him, causing him and his family to be buried alive amongst the bricks and the debris. It took 5.5 hours for him to be rescued, so intense was the damage. Pulled from the rubble, Robert miraculously escapes with little more than a cut on his head, but his younger brother did not survive. At less than 2 years, Wallace Cochran is one of the children who lost their lives during the Clydebank Blitz. Robert says, "I remember lying in the dust, sensing the weight of material on top of me. It was pitch black and claustrophobic, but then I remember the soldiers digging me out. At that point I remember looking down the street and seeing this building had gone, except for the one gable with a black piano hanging there. Wallace had been wrapped in a coat under the kitchen table by my aunt. The soldiers dug him out and they handed him to my mother. He was unmarked, except for a small mark on his forehead." Sadly, the tragedy of what happened to Robert's brother Wallace was one of many. Right across the town, harrowing scenes were unfolding, leaving survivors today with painful memories. In a newspaper interview during 2016, John Scanlon, who was 87, recounts a tale of horror. He talks of how he remembers seeing very vividly and very clearly a young dead girl lying in the street. As she lay there face down, her hair is washed over the back of her head due to the water from a burst water main. In the confusion and panic of the falling bombs, John became separated from his family. He wasn't sure if they were dead or alive. He remembers how in the morning of the 14th of March 1941 there were bodies everywhere. "I saw my mum. She was walking up and down a line of bodies covered in white sheets. She was lifting the sheets and looking, trying to find me." Today the Clydebank Blitz remains vivid in the memories of the remaining survivors, because what they experienced is something they will never, ever forget.